Hey guys, this is Chase from Your Office Pro. Glad you could join us. Today, we're going to be covering the topic of letters of intent or lease proposals. This one's for your industrial, retail, office tenants that are out there in the marketplace looking for a space to lease. Maybe you're looking to relocate an existing facility, open a new office or a new location. Maybe you're looking to renew in an existing place where you're already leasing. And this applies in any of those scenarios. So we're just going to cover some of the most important things that we see tenants make mistakes on or not be aware of, things to be paying attention to when you're going through that process. And this is for tenants, again, that are toured properties, got some options they like. Next step is to start evaluating where do they want to be, what are the high level terms of that deal. You've got to negotiate those deals and you want to make sure you're not leaving money on the table. So this is some important takeaways, some things to keep in mind when you're doing that. And at the very end of the video, I'll go ahead and do a screen share and show what these proposals look like in case you're not aware, and what some of these high level provisions look like and how they're worded. Should be a good video. We'll try to keep it nice and tight. Let's jump into it. The very first thing that I would mention that I see tenants doing all the time, especially when they aren't represented or they're represented by someone who maybe isn't as familiar with this process, make sure that you have a proposal in writing. And ideally, what I mean by that is a Word document, something that you can switch on red line tracking, and you can actually track changes as the proposal terms are countered from you to the landlord and responded back to you. If you're talking to a property where the landlord has a decent commercial agent who's representing them, chances are that's what you'll get. You'll say, hey, we're interested in getting a proposal for this property. Can you send us something? Usually want to know the name of the tenant, what type of lease term you're considering, when you'd want to commence the space. Those three things are very important up front. You tell them that should be enough to get this process started. That in and of itself, getting something in a Word document is crucial, and I can't stress that enough. A lot of times, if you see someone just kind of getting lazy in this process and just sending something via email, just the body of the email, and typing out some of those provisions, first of all, as you go back and forth in this process, especially if you're evaluating more than one property, it's very difficult to keep all of those details in focus and not miss something. If that's going back and forth, it could be something that you missed or didn't quite understand or thought you understood it one way. And it could be something that the landlord or their agent misinterprets. And the worst thing that can happen is for you to think you've come to terms on a space and everything's ironed out and you feel really good about the deal. And then you go ahead and have them draft a lease agreement and you go through that lease and you realize, hey, that's not what we agreed to. This point's not correct. That point's not correct. And there could be some significant changes, significant dollars that are on the line there. It's a huge point. I really want to make sure that I stress that. I'm going to show you what one of these looks like later in the video. You want to make sure that you're using one of these. This could be an agent that's representing you as a tenant rep that's using this. They have templates that they could input, send that over to the landlord. So in cases where the landlord doesn't have their own form or their agent doesn't have something to use, if they're sending you something via email, don't accept it. And if they're sending you something in PDF, don't accept that either. Make sure they send it to you in an editable format. The fact that they're going to send you some terms doesn't mean you need to sign it. You shouldn't be signing the first thing they give you. It should be something in an editable form, and you can get it, you can review it, you can redline and counter those terms back and forth and see what works best for you. So that's tip number one. Number two, something to keep in mind about these LOIs, these lease proposals. Varying terminology, different brokers will refer to them a different way. At the end of the day, what this is a term sheet, a summary of some high-level deal points that, if agreed to, you would move on to reviewing a lease agreement. And all of those terms would then be incorporated into the lease agreement. You'd have to review that very closely, have an attorney review it. This initial LOI is non-binding. It is legally non-binding. It is not a contract. It should state that. Usually towards the end of the proposal, you'll see it listed. You'll see it stipulated in there. This is not a legally binding document. These are non-binding terms, and neither party is bound by these terms unless an agreement, a lease agreement, a legally binding contract is signed by both parties. So you've got to keep that in mind. I think a lot of tenants don't realize that. And one important fact there to remember then is you're not required to only be talking to one property at a time. In fact, your agent, if you have one working with you, would tell you, let's go talk to multiple properties. If you've toured 5 or 6, maybe there are 1 or 2 you really like, make sure that you've got proposals for both of those properties. Be negotiating on them at the same time. you're not bound to either of those. You want to make sure that the proposal states that. It's non-binding to either party unless a lease agreement is signed. It should state that in there, and you need to know that. And so really use that to your advantage and be talking to multiple properties at once. So it's an important thing to remember and keep that in mind. Okay, point number 3 to keep in mind about lease proposals is that it is a high-level document, and it really is only covering the top 10 to 15, maybe 20 deal points that are most critical. And those aren't the same for every single deal, for every single tenant, for every single landlord. They will be different. There are some different points that could be very important to you as the tenant, and you may want to insert them. You will get a proposal typically from the landlord. It may have 10, 12 provisions on there. If there's something that's important to you, you add it. You make sure you insert a new row, you add it. An example of this could be a relocation provision. Office tenants in a multi-tenant building, you'd be familiar with this. Smaller tenants very often have a provision in their lease that says they can be relocated to another space in the building if the landlord deems it necessary. Lots of reasons why they might want to do that. Lots of reasons why you as the tenant would not want them to be able to do that. That's a topic for another video. That is an example of something that as a tenant, maybe that's happened to you in the past. You didn't really enjoy the experience. You want to make sure going forward that's not in the lease. One way you could avoid that issue when you get to the lease agreement is to put that in the initial proposal up front. You're telling the landlord from the very first communication, hey, this is an important deal point for me. Tenant should not be able to be relocated. The landlord shouldn't have that right to substitute their premises, to move them somewhere else in the building. And so that's an example. Personal guarantees could be another example. Options to renew, options to terminate the lease. There are lots of different things that could be in this LOI as you're starting negotiations. Be thinking through what matters to me most, what's most important. And that may not be the same in property A versus property B. And you want to be thinking through that. Be thinking, what do I need to add to this document? What's not being talked about? And keep in mind, not everything that goes into that lease is going to be covered in this LOI. These are the high level deal points. They're the things that if you can get agreement on these are really the things that matter most. We're talking about the rent. How much free rent are you getting? When is this lease going to commence? Like I said, the operating expenses or termination options, those types of things could be very important. It varies from one property to another, but make sure that's all in one place. Everyone's working off the same sheet. Everyone's on the same page. Okay, so those are some important points to keep in mind about lease proposals when you're negotiating with a landlord. Now, let's go ahead and jump on a screen share and I'll walk you through a redacted live actual example from one of my clients to show you what this looks like and just give you some ideas of things you might want to be considering. Okay, so this is an example of an initial proposal with a few items redacted just to give you an idea. This was an office building, so some of the terms and provisions will be office specific, but again, it'll give you the general idea. So this proposal should be identifying some important things. It should be identifying the address of the building involved, the tenant name, that should be the actual legal entity name for the tenant, the landlord who owns the building, exactly what legal entity will be signing a lease. Some of this may be in there, the total size of the building, the number of floors, sometimes not. Not terribly important if it's in there or not usually. Premises or leased premises will refer to the space that would be for lease. So you want this in here, identifying when we're talking about the space, what suite is it, how big is it, and you should be able to have that in there. Term, commencement, so when is the lease starting? Usually you'll see these split into two different sections. Commencement is when is the lease starting, and term is how long is the lease going to be. So this is saying it's a 42-month term, defining that as lease term anywhere else you see that referred to. And then it shall commence on January 1, 2023. Keep in mind all of these provisions, all of these items are negotiable items so that you may want to redline, like you're seeing here, some items redline to send back to the landlord as a counter. You would want to do that. So if you say, hey, I don't want this lease to start January, I want it to commence in March 1, then you would redline that back to them. Or, depending on how much free rent you're getting, the term may be longer or shorter. The rental rate. So there should be a section for rental rate. I recommend having this section written out showing months 1 through 3, 0. Months 4 through 15 at whatever base rate, and so on, just to make sure it is very clear and upfront and everybody's on the same page of what that rent schedule looks like. In this case, in this example, it's more generically written to say just increasing 2% per annum. And they had on the anniversary of the lease commencement, which means if you had 3 months free rent, you're only getting 9 months at that rate starting, and then it's going to bump 2%. So just as an example, that's one of those things you would spot. And if you hadn't been very clear in the proposal, you might get to the lease agreement and it's written differently than what you were expecting. So this is one of those things it would be in everyone's best interest to be very clear and spell out how many months you're getting free, when is it escalating. And you can see from the red lines, what we were trying to do is you get a certain rate, but you're going to get that rate for 12 full months after your rental abatement period. And they were initially offering 3 months of free rent, and we are striking that and coming back for 6 months of free rent. So if we got this, the tenant would be paying that $24 rate starting month 7 and going all the way to month 18, as opposed to only getting it for 6 months if the way they had originally wrote it was accepted. So that's something you'd want to look into. Operating expenses is something you'll typically see in the proposal. And since this is a net rental rate, you'll want to know what those expenses are because it's going to be added on top of that base rate. So you can see this is a rather expensive building with base rates at $28 and then additional $19 of operating expenses on top. And you will see that we've gone ahead and added a cap on controllable operating expenses, trying to negotiate that in. So again, these are things that you want to be talking about early in the process of negotiations, not waiting until you get to a lease agreement. And so that's what you will use this lease proposal form to do. Landlord's work contribution or a tenant improvement allowance would be how you'd see this section. So this is talking about, how much money are they giving the tenant? Right now they're offering $15 a foot on the space. And up here, you can see down here, we negotiated some percentage of that allowance can be allocated towards soft costs, including relocation expenses, so your moving costs. Sometimes you'll add in your furniture. If you're buying new furniture, you could use some of that credit toward furniture expense or additional free rent. So if you're getting 6 months free rent and you don't use all of your allowance, you could get an additional rent credit owed. So those are some things we would typically do to try and just get more savings for the client. So you may want to try and do something like that. And some of these other things, as I mentioned, is early access to the space before the commencement, having renewal options. In this case, they wanted a right of first refusal to expand into another suite that was next to them. Section to cover parking, what the cost is, what the parking ratio is. So you get the point. Early in this video, I mentioned that certain provisions will be covered in the lease and not covered in the proposal. Assignment and subletting is an example of that. Normally, that's not in an initial proposal. It's just something you would hash out during the lease agreement. But if a tenant had a very specific need or a very specific desire to review that and negotiate that point early in the deal, then we would recommend putting it in to the proposal. I also want to point out acceptance here. We talked about this earlier in the video that something similar to this effect should be written in every proposal that you're looking at. And it is stipulating that unless and until a definitive lease agreement is signed, neither party is obligated to do anything. So this is the proposal shall be binding between the parties. So basically, they're saying that neither party is going to have any rights. This is not a contractual obligation. This is not a contract of any sort. This is a preliminary expression, discussion purposes only. You're going to see these types of words and phrases in this section. You want to make sure that's in there, or I'd recommend adding it just to be clear that that is not what's happening. So I hope that's helpful for you guys. Good luck as you go out and start negotiating these lease proposals. And I hope this video helps you have more fruitful negotiations with landlords and their brokers, and hopefully saves you some money. Thanks.